And I see folks are coming in. I recognize some faces from last night. That's fantastic. And we're about to start tonight's program. Kwe Nidabok and Delawazi Vera Longtoe Sheehan. Hello, friends. My name is Vera Longtoe Sheehan, and I'm the director of the Vermont Abenaki Artist Association and the founder of the Abenaki Arts and Education Center. Tonight, I'm joined by Vermont Abenaki Artist Association artist Sherry Gould of the Nulhegan Abenaki tribe. And before we get started, I would like to thank everybody for joining us in this virtual session of the Abenaki Heritage Weekend, in quotes, because it's not really the weekend. This session is being recorded so we can rebroadcast it for those who couldn't make it. The Virtual Abenaki Heritage Weekend was organized by the Vermont Abenaki Artist Association and the Abenaki Arts and Education Center. Events like these give visitors an Abenaki perspective on life in the Champlain Valley and throughout Ndakina, which is our homeland. You can find more announcements for the Heritage Weekend and other events like this if you visit Vermont Abenaki Artist Association's Facebook or Twitter pages. Before we get started, we would like to take a moment to thank our partners at Lake Champlain Maritime Museum and our sponsors. This event was funded in part by the Vermont Humanities Council, New England Foundation for the Arts, and the National Endowment for the Arts. In this virtual session, we welcome Sherry Gould, who is the tribal genealogist for the Nulhegan Abenaki tribe, one of the lead organizers for the Abenaki Trails Project, and an Abenaki basket maker. And this evening, she will do a presentation about Abenaki basket makers. Thank you, Sherry, for joining us today. I'm going to turn this over to Sherry Gould.
Kwai, Indelawazi Sally Gould, Indai Monadnock, and Wikiak Massaseacum. And I said, my name is Sherry Gould, and I was born in Peterborough, New Hampshire, and I live in a little section of Warner, New Hampshire, that's just south of Lake Massaseacum. And it's wonderful to be here with you all. I see some friendly faces. I'm here to talk to you about Abenaki basket makers, women who have carried the culture. I'll tell you a little bit more about myself. I am a basket maker. I'm going to be sharing a PowerPoint presentation. So that's what you'll be seeing as we go through the talk. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Good. Okay, very good. So today we're going to talk about Abenaki women basket making and cultural survival. And this is a presentation I did quite some time ago. I've updated it a little bit. The information I'm going to share with you is the best information that we have available at this point, or that I have available in talking with other people. I am a member of the Nulhegan Cultural and Historic and Cultural Preservation Unit, and Brian Chenevert, who is our tribal historian, is the head of that department. Brian and I are looking at some possibilities of maybe some earlier information than what I'll be sharing with you in this presentation. So like all things, this is an ongoing study, and this represents the best information we have available to date. So what we'll go over in the presentation, the goal here is to look at the role of women in keeping Abenaki culture alive through basket making. Specifically, we'll be looking at fancy basket industry at Odanak through the eyes of the Watso family, who wound up retailing their baskets in Newbury, New Hampshire, and Abenaki utilitarian basket makers of Vermont and New Hampshire in Ndakina. And that group is totally unrelated from the Odanak basket makers as a distinct group. There's some ties we'll talk about, but and then modern day tradition bearers of Abenaki fancy and utilitarian basket makers. So there's been extensive research conducted on Native American trans-border basket trade. Most notably for the Abenaki, it was by Gaby Pelletier and Gordon Day. Gordon Day was an ethno-historian who lived originally in Hopkinton, New Hampshire, which is right nearby. And Gaby Pelletier is in the Maritimes. I apologize, I don't know exactly where Gaby is, but we did have her come down to Warner to the Kearsarge Abenaki Museum. We did a wonderful program called Baskets Out of the Attic, where people brought their baskets in and we were able to review them. But the two of them have done a great deal of research. There's also an article in the Canadian Magazine of Politics, Science, Art and Language from August of 1922 that goes into detail about the Odanak basket trade at that point in time. There was also a lecture done at the Symposium on Borderlands, Culture and Canadian-U.S. International Boundary. That was done in June of 2010, and it included a lecture by Beverly Diamond from Memorial University in Newfoundland called Native American Women and Cross-Border Tourism in the Early 20th Century. She focused primarily on Iroquois and Micmac basketry, but she included some really useful information for this study. So in looking at brown ash, which is the material that we make our baskets from primarily, brown ash and sweetgrass, brown ash has been integral to our culture. It's part of our creation story. And I'm not a storyteller, so I'm not going to do a great job telling you our creation story, but I will just say briefly that in our creation story, originally Gluskabe created people from stone, and they were cold and they walked the earth really heavy and they crushed things, and it just wasn't so good. So after crumbling those people up, and there's another whole story about what happened with the fragments that we won't get into, Gluskabe then looked at the ash trees, and what he saw was that in the ash, it was really supple. Whoops, change my notes here. Graceful, how the ash danced very gracefully in the wind. And so he traced out the shape of humans on the ash trees, and wherever he would shoot his arrow into the tree, a human stepped forward. So it's really a part of our, right from the very beginning, our creation story. Our people have always known ash really well in their work with making snowshoes and canoes. And then in time, the colonists in Quebec and New England brought willow baskets here, which they used a great deal. So our ancestors saw what was happening, what the desire was of the colonists for basketry. Excuse me. Historically, there's been a lot of interaction between the colonists throughout all of Indochina, but definitely in New Hampshire and Quebec. And it's one of the things Vera mentioned, that we're working on the Abenaki Trails project. And that's one of the things in that project that we're focusing on, is the interactions between the colonists and Abenaki people historically right through to today. So historically, at the time of contact, we see a lot of mutual interactions going on back and forth. And mostly what gets recorded is the warlike activities, but there were common activities happening all the time. So this image has nothing to do with New England or Indochina or Abenaki people, but it was the best image I could find of colonials interacting with Native people. In New Hampshire, there was a situation over on the seacoast, which I'll talk more about in the next slide. But in our Abenaki Trails project, what we found is that, I should tell a little bit about that project. So in July, several of us from the Nulhegan tribe who live here in this area of New Hampshire decided to work initially with Hopkinton, New Hampshire. Hopkinton's a town that changed last year from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. One of our tribal members, Daryl Peasley, lives there. The Historical Society had focused on colonial and Abenaki interactions and the Abenaki culture in their programming all last summer. So that was initially our point of contact, our focus of our project. As time went on, it became pretty clear that the settlement in West Hopkinton extended into Eastern Henniker, and another settlement area in along the Warner River extended beyond the borders into Warner. And we began to realize that our ancestors didn't draw little square boxes on a map to settle, but lived where the land made sense. And so we expanded it from Hopkinton, and we're looking at Henniker and Bradford and Warner. So it's a 4-town area that runs along the Kentucky and the Warner rivers. So the interactions have been just fascinating as they've come to light. In Henniker, we found that the colonists were actually, it's recorded in the history of the town, aiding and abetting our warriors when they were doing raids on the towns, and that the local colonials knew our language really, really well. So many things are coming to light where place names or people, it was just very clear that the early colonists knew our language better than I know it today. So we have that contact happening. So you can see where willow baskets that the colonials were using became something that the Abenaki saw. At the same time, the whole issues with loss of life that happened with the pandemics of the time, and so that whole disruption to our society and the land being taken away, people moving, it was really important that we find a new means to survive economically. And so baskets became a primary way. The picture at the bottom of the screen, that basket, is specifically from a basket that's found at the Hopkinton Historical Society. And this basket came to light at that basket out of the attic stay. And when Gaby Pelletier looked at it, and I knew some of the history in terms of, so the history of the basket is that a family, the Hanson family, had donated it in 1870, and Alfred Hanson, and he reported the basket to be 100 years old, and it was something that had been in his family, and his family had lived at Dover. Well, in Dover, New Hampshire, we had Mr. Waldron, who ran a trade place with the Pennacook. There's a long, rather negative history, and it honestly was, it ended toward the end of that involvement. He was very dishonest. He broke the laws. He was more than happy to sell alcohol and guns to the Pennacook against the law, which ran against the laws of the state. He was dishonest with his weights and measures. He was making a great deal of money off his trade with the Indians there. A lot of the Massachusetts Indians had come north to New Hampshire in response to the difficulties with the Indian Wars happening in Massachusetts. And we're talking in the 1670 time period here. So there came a point where the officials from Massachusetts there were about 400 natives living around about 41 colonist families over what was called Cocheco at the time. It's now Dover, New Hampshire. And officials from the Massachusetts government, colonial government, wanted to arrest all of them, to capture all of them, to bring them to Boston, and ultimately sell most of them into slavery. But Waldron convinced them not to take the Pennacook, to only take the Massachusetts. And so they had agreed that they would have a mock battle. And that's when you read the white written history, that's what it says. But for those of us in the Abenaki community, we know that war games was always a part of our culture and our history. And so when they, so that was what was going on. It was a war game they were convinced to engage in. And when they agreed to it, and they set it up so it would be the Massachusetts against the Pennacook. That automatically separated our peoples, and the Massachusetts were all abducted and taken to Boston. Some were killed and others were sold into slavery. Later on, we find that, get my glasses on here, that Samson Battis, who had won his freedom from serving in the Revolutionary War, and his wife, Samson Battis, excuse me, his wife was said to be a West Indies slave, a Native American, but that is where those Massachusetts Indians were sold into slavery. So we believe she was one of them who came back and was serving a family here in New Hampshire, and the two of them married and were freed, and he became chief of what became known as the Battis tribe and lived in Loudon, New Hampshire. So given all of this history, we then find that the Pennacook were so upset about this whole trick that got played on them that it precipitated the move to Odanak. And Pennacooks were some of the first Indians to go to France and settle in that abandoned French village. So, whoops, lost my train of thought for a second there. So they retaliated, and there was a big raid on the community, and Waldron was killed. But at a later time, another raid, there was a Hanson taken captive and was adopted by the Indians. So we believe that this basket is the result of Elizabeth Hanson's captivity, and it stayed in the Hanson family for 100 years and then wound up. It's Gaby Pelletier, who's really the best known expert on Wabanaki basketry, believes this is the oldest brown ash splint basket, Indian basket that she's ever seen. So that's pretty cool. It was a pretty exciting find from our baskets out of the attic day. Okay, so basket making became a way for the Indians to survive after contact and the resulting diaspora in New England. And Abenaki women played an instrumental role in building the industry that created wealth for an entire community. In the article I mentioned earlier, it was reported in 1922 that Odanak was bringing in $250,000 annually. Once that was reported, the government started to take action, because that wasn't really what they wanted to see, was a Native community becoming wealthy. And I can tell you that the first time I went to Odanak, it was a short time after I had visited Pine Ridge, and I didn't know what to expect. And so I went prepared for some pretty dire conditions, and I drove right through Odanak. I thought I was still in the French village. I noticed the names were like Tolba Street. They were Abenaki words, but anyway, I finally stopped at a farm and asked where the reservation was, and they said you just drove through it. So Odanak is indeed quite a wealthy little, it's clear, you can see where the basket money made it indistinguishable from the French towns, communities surrounding it. So many tribes made and sold baskets, but Abenaki baskets were by far the most lucrative among all the tribes. This picture is an encampment that was in Franconia, New Hampshire, about 1860. And so it was common for for all Wabanaki people who made baskets, and it went far beyond the Abenaki. I mean, the Penobscot made baskets, the Micmac, and still do, the Micmac. All of the tribes made basket making as a means of income and survival. But at Odanak in the winter months, the men would go off to hunt, and they were frequently employed as hunting guides for wealthy men from the States. And here we see Louis Tahamo. Wait a minute, I told you technology is not my best thing here. My little bar on the side where people's pictures are is hiding my text. All right, that's better. Whoops, what did I do? I went, oh dear, now I gotta, I'm sorry. Excuse me 1 minute. Well, This challenged person gets back to the beginning and goes back to the slide I want to be on. Oh dear, no, that didn't do it. I was on this slide. Here we go, and play. Okay, so later we're going to talk about Louis Tahamant's daughter, Catherine, and she married Louis Watso, and they're the ones that settled in Newbury, New Hampshire. But this shows that, you know, Louis was a guide hunting, and Ely Rober was another hunting guide. He's shown there in the canoe leading some fishermen. So while the men were doing those activities, the women were busy making baskets, and there was no time to dread winter with so much to do. And ooh, with this recent storm, it's easy to dread winter, isn't it? But here we see Alanis Obamsawin braiding sweetgrass with other girls at Odenak. And we see a group of women all busy making baskets. In that article in the Canadian magazine, they talk about how baskets were always by their side, like knitting is for many people today. And that the whole family was involved. The children, as we see here, braiding sweetgrass. And for anyone who doesn't know, Alanis Obamsawin is an incredible filmmaker. She was born here in New Hampshire, but she's a member of the Odenak Abenaki tribe. And if you ever get a chance to look at any of her films, they're all incredible. But for our people, always, women and men have had separate but distinct roles, or equal, separate but equal. And so for women, it was always running the village, and they were responsible for setting up their shelters. If they were the communities that moved, they were moved with the seasons. They were responsible for making decisions about when to go to war, because war meant losing men, and it would be very disruptive to the community. So they had the final say on whether or not the tribe would go to war. They chose the chief. They really had all of the decision making around the village, while the men handled all the commerce with people away. They went and did the hunting. And when we're talking about basket making, the men's role was to, and still is in most families, to gather the tree, to cut the trees down, to pound the ash strips out, while the women's responsibilities had more to do with making sure that all of the materials they needed were secured. And what we found happening at Odenak while this incredible industry was building is that the women would actually hire people, not even Abenaki people. They would hire French women to help with constructing the baskets. The French farmers were raising sweetgrass and braiding it and selling it to the Abenaki. These were businesswomen, and they were making a lot of decisions. But the men had an important role as well. The men also would be packing things up to go to their summer destinations. So after making baskets all winter, in the summer, they would go to tourist destinations. This trunk is at the museum at Odenak, and it was a trunk that the Watso family made, and it was used to pack all of their smaller fancy baskets in to go to their summer destinations. And this is where they would bring their hired girls to help maybe do the demonstrations while they were running the businesses. In the lecture that Beverly Diamond did about the cross-border commerce, she was saying that the women had a much easier go of it in these Victorian tourist areas. They were just much more accepted, and they could move freely and interact easily with the tourists, whereas the men were more feared, and it was much harder for the men to be able to do those kind of interactions with people directly. That made a lot of sense to me in terms of our history books all say that the Abenaki were all gone from New Hampshire by 1725. 1725 was the date at which the Pennacook had just given up on peaceful living with the settlers, and the warriors were all gone. they left. And I really think that was it. I think that it was that fear of the warriors and that carried over into Victorian times. But each family would pick their own area for basket trade. And those movements from Odanak then down to the tourist areas kind of mimicked some of the movements of the old hunting and farming days, where the Abenaki would go from their hunting place to their farming place, their agricultural place, and some to the seashore afterwards. We're finding with the Abenaki Trails Project that people here probably didn't move a lot. There was a lot of fishing going available in the rivers and lakes right here. There's excellent farming grounds and great hunting as well. So we didn't probably see a lot of movement, but that was pretty common in other areas. And it seems that the families would go back to areas probably where their families had come from originally, that families that were from areas that were familiar to them. So for here in New Hampshire, here's some examples of what was going on with that trade when they would come down to sell the baskets. And so we see in Bethlehem, the center image, and in Echo, New Hampshire, the one in the lower right-hand corner, and Intervale over on the left. The lower right-hand image is Louis Watso and Catherine. And that was about 1896 that picture was taken, I believe, because we find them, they were living at Odanak and recording the christening of their children there. And then the deaths of two of their children are recorded in the New Hampshire vital records in Woodstock and the towns in that area. And then, let me get my glasses out so I can read my dates here. I don't memorize well. Well, here's some interesting facts I'll add too. From about 1860 to 1920, the Abenaki basket trade flourished. Gabby Pelletier refers to this as the first stage of the industry development. According to Gordon Day, the Oliver Wawanalet family made about 4,400 in 1900, selling baskets in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and Michigan in 1922. In Michigan. In 1922, it was reported that the basket industry was rumored to have brought in 215,000 to the reserve. At the height of the business, the Abenaki bought their braided grass from families in Pierreville, which I've already talked about. So the White Mountains were a popular area for the Watso, Laurent, and Sadaquist families to bring their baskets to. Okay, let's go to the next slide. By the 1920s, a Maliseet Indian named Phineas Laurent and his Huron wife had moved to Pierreville, learned the trade and the basket trade, and started to undercut other dealers. So when the Canadian government saw how lucrative this business was becoming, they started to establish traders. So they were Canadian government sanctioned basket traders. And then there were limitations put on the ability of the Abenaki at Odanak to move across the border to sell their baskets. And then there were specific basket styles that were desirable, that they were pushed to weave, and molds were made. And then the government provided the supplies to the Abenaki. So they had to pay for the supplies, and the profits got wheedled down more and more and more. This Maliseet fellow, he kind of honed in on some of the other basket traders, but he was no better to the Abenaki. He just was better to himself. So it was right around that, just a little before that time, that Louis and Catherine decided to settle permanently in Newbury, New Hampshire. So we can see that they were in Franconia in 1899. They were in Newbury, and they were in Franconia 1895 to 96, Newbury 1899, and then they settled in Claremont, New Hampshire about 1910. They were very, very well loved and received in Newbury, New Hampshire, and the records are all really clear that Louis was a fireman there. He bought and sold cottages. So you see them in regalia on on the left there with their 2 children, and then their cottage is the picture at the top on the right, and then at the bottom is their basket shop in Newbury. So Catherine would make the baskets, and Louis would take his canoe and paddle around Lake Sunapee and sell the baskets to the tourists. So it was a little different than what we heard about from Beverly Diamond. The experiences were in some other areas. In Newbury, they were accepted as a family, and Louis was a valued member of the community. Louis's granddaughter came with her son to basket language camps we held here. And it was so exciting because at one point, the language teacher, who was Philippe from came down from Odenak, and he was talking about kina si, kina na, kina ni, talking about look at this or look at that. And all of a sudden, Margaret, who said she never learned any language, they never wanted to teach her basket making or the language, she goes, I remember my grandfather saying that when he would take us out on the lake. So that was pretty exciting. But those 2 little girls, so that was one of those, is her mother, and Margaret's mother. And she said they never learned the language really, and their parents did not want them making baskets, even though when they were little, they would dress them in costumes to sell the baskets to help with the family finances to support the family. They encouraged them to marry. They married outside the tribe and stayed here. But what caused them really to make the permanent move down here was the Indian boarding schools. The oldest daughter had been taken to school. She was devastated. She begged her parents to not have to go again, and they moved to Newbury to avoid that. So we were fortunate to have them come and do their baskets here, but it wasn't fortunate for them. So that pretty much sums up the Odenak basket trade. Basket makers continue to make baskets, and we'll see a little bit about one Odenak basket maker who taught my teacher and how that has blessed so many of us. But right now we're going to turn to some Nulhegan basket makers. So in our histories, in my own family history and other family histories of Nulhegan members, our ancestors were known as gypsies, and there are Phillips family members in New Hampshire whose birth certificates give their race as gypsy, but they knew they were Abenaki. And they had no Romanov ancestry. They did have Abenaki ancestry. So when we first started the Abenaki Trails Project, pretty soon into it, the Warner Historical Society, Lynn Clark, handed me this electronic folder of newspaper clippings. So this is from the Kearsarge Independent from May 23rd, 1884. And it says, Warner, a handful of gypsies passed through the town on Tuesday. It consisted of 3 families, a team to each family, and encamped on the road to the lower village just below John Tewksbury's for the night. They started from New York and had traveled through Vermont and were on their way to the cities below. They sell baskets of their own manufacturer. So you can imagine my excitement, because in my own family, which is Eber Dyer on the left is pictured there with his daughter and grandson, and Eber's family, Simon Dyer and Elizabeth Blake, had been basket makers who traveled by horse and wagon and made their baskets. And we have documentation of Eber's sister-in-law talking about the parents and how they lived, and that they would go into the woods and pound the ash and make their baskets and then sell them. And they would also husk corn and braid the corn husks and make mats and bee baskets, she called them, but I think it's bee skips, and sell them. And then Fred Tuttle was a farmer in Vermont. Some of you may have heard of him, and if you haven't, you can look him up. He was a pretty famous guy. There's videos on YouTube of him. He was an old farmer who became a politician to save the state from a dreaded, I think it was a New Yorker who was going to come in and be senator or something. He's a pretty funny guy. But our family would go to his parents' farm, and he remembers that as a child. And one of our cousins interviewed him and has the recording, and we have the transcript talking about them going out and pounding the ash and husking the corn and braiding it, and that the Blakes were great horse people, he said, and they would go to the Tunbridge Fair and sell their baskets and trade horses and what have you. So the Phillips family actually went into New York more than the Blakes or the Dyers, but they were intermarrying, the Phillips and the Blakes and the Dyers, and all of them were basket makers. The basket at the bottom of this image was one that was given to the Vermont Historical Society. Let me read again here so I get it right. In 1983 by Elizabeth White, who reported that it was given to her grandparents by the gypsies, quote, in payment for hay for their horses. And it's dated to the latter part of the 19th century. Eber Dyer said, my grandmother was born in Gardner, Mass. So they would travel, like I said, northern Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Vermont. But he settled in Peterborough, New Hampshire, and he was one of the first basket weavers at the Peterborough Basket Company there. And there's no ties between any of those families that I've been able to find to the reserve at Odenak. Now, the Sweetser family was another family, but in that family, a Sweetser came from Switzerland is the family history, and married an Abenaki woman, Linda Hill. And the basketry they came up with was kind of a combination of some European techniques and some Abenaki techniques. Newt was born in 1915 in Stowe, Vermont, the grandson of Gilman Sweetser. And Newt was fifth generation Sweetser basket maker. He lived in Bethlehem, New Hampshire. He was a recipient of the National Heritage Fellowship in 1987 from the National Endowment for the Arts. And he was our mentor, and he crossed over March 26 in 2011. So Bill and I were very fortunate. Newt was 92 years old, and he took us on as apprentices, and we got to learn from him. It's funny because prior to that, I spent a year as an apprentice with Jeannie Brink, and Jeannie makes fancy baskets. And I was so excited when she agreed to take me on as an apprentice. And I spent the whole year, and I loved making the baskets and learned all about the different molds and how to do the fancy cowis and the sweetgrass and all the wonderful things. I just loved it. Then what happened was Jeannie and I were going to do our second year, but she had a previous apprentice who wanted to do her second year. So I had a year break, and I was able to put together an application and get Newt to agree to work with us. And we spent the year. So I got really excited about that because I realized I had learned enough to know my ancestors were not fancy basket makers. They were utilitarian basket makers. Well, I did it. And utilitarian baskets, there's a lot of carving. There's a lot of different methods used. And I would have a hard time. My hands just didn't have that strength. And Newt would say, you can strengthen your hands, dear. But in the meantime, Bill had come along to learn how to pound the ash and identify ash trees. He's a logger, but brown ash trees are not a valuable lumber. And so he didn't know anything about them. He kept telling me they weren't around here. And so he came to learn that part of it, and also to pound splint for Newt in exchange for the internship. And so when Newt would say, you can strengthen your hands, dear, so you can do that, I said, why would I do that? I have strong hands. I married them. So we very much follow the traditional Abenaki patterns. Bill does the rims, but over time, Bill was doing everything except weaving the baskets. So he said, maybe I should weave a basket. So as it all turned out, Bill is a utilitarian basket maker, and I am a fancy basket maker. And I was very blessed to be able to do a second year with Jeannie Brink in the fancy basket making. So so that brings us to our cultural links for the Abenaki today. While historians say that all Indians were gone from New Hampshire by 1725, basket makers provide a trail of survival. Jeannie learned from Sophie Nolet at Odanak, and Jeannie's family had come to Vermont from Odanak in I believe in the latter 1800s. So Sophie was a noted Abenaki fancy basket maker at Odanak, and Jeannie's ancestor is I'm not going to say this right, Elvine Obomsawin Royce, and she was born to Simon and Selina Obomsawin on March 5th, 1886 at Odanak. And after traveling for a number of years between Canada and Vermont, Simon Obomsawin moved to the Thompson Point area, the town of Charlotte, becoming the caretaker of the newly built summer cottages there. Later, Elvine followed her father to Vermont, where she married and raised a family of 6 children. Like her mother and siblings, she was a traditional ash splint and sweetgrass basket maker, and they practiced their craft there until 1959. That year, Elvine shared her family story of Robert, yeah, I'm going to read it because I'm getting all tongue-tied on it, of Robert Rogers' raid of Odanak. So I had mentioned Gordon Day, the ethnohistorian that originally was living in Hopkinton, New Hampshire. He was originally a forester, and then he became really interested in the Abenaki religion. And a lot of that had to do with botany and wanting to know the names of the trees. But he just really dug in. And so there are many recordings that Gordon did with different Abenaki people, and one of them was with Elvine, and she told the oral history of what happened when Rogers Rangers raided Odanak. Jeannie had never heard that story. She told it to him in Abenaki and recorded it. So Gordon later translated it to English, and when he did, it filled in like all these blanks. In fact, there's a wonderful book that Marge Bruchac did on Malian song that if you get a chance, read it. It's a children's book, but it tells that story. So Rogers turned in a report, and then the French turned in a report, and the two were widely different. But when you hear the oral history, the missing piece that a tribal person can give to the historical story, a lot of pieces fell into place, and it helped to, it really helped all of us to understand Rogers' raid and what happened there. So anyway, Jeannie learned from Sophie basket making because just like in the Watso family, just like in my family, our families didn't want us to be identified as Indian. They wanted us to have freedom from the persecution that was going on. We had eugenics. There were a lot of reasons to want to protect us from being identified as Abenaki. That's the reason why they preferred to be identified as gypsies. But at any rate, Jeannie learned from Sophie, so that brought it back to her family. She taught it to me, that brought it back to our family, and a lot of other families as well, as you'll see. So 2 other families. Okay, so these pictures I should go over real quickly. So we've got my granddaughter, Millie, making a basket on the left. And this is the camp where the Obomsawans sold their baskets at Thompson Point. And then Jeannie's on the right, working on basket making. So the other 2 families that we're going to talk briefly about are the Bowles and the Wood families in Vermont. And here we have on the right, my cousin Valerie Bowles and her daughters Emily and Megan. And I mentioned we used to do language basket making camps here in Warner, and Valerie came over with her daughters and met Jeannie here and became an apprentice under Jeannie and learned basket making. And then on the left of the page, we have Nulhegan tribal member and cousin to Jeannie, Carrie Royce Wood, and her son Aaron Wood. And they also were able to apprentice with Jeannie And again, you see that there's the rolls. Aaron's pounding the log, and they both weave baskets, and they make beautiful baskets. And here's my mom, who learned to make baskets from me. So this presentation hopefully has helped you to understand some traditional values, philosophies, and history, along with other aspects of the culture that are transmitted through basket making. And this is just some contact information. I talked briefly about Abenaki Trails, and at the bottom you can see we're on Facebook if you're interested in learning more. We also do have a webpage, AbenakiTrails.com, or if you go to the Nulhegan webpage, one of the tabs will take you to Abenaki Trails and take you to our page.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Sherry. And I believe we already have some questions for you. Let me just open this up. Okay, so we have a few questions that were sent in advance.
Okay.
Let me get to them. Okay, so do the weaving patterns have specific meanings? Do certain patterns are certain patterns for specific families?
To my knowledge, the only pattern I weave that I know of has any meaning is the friendship pattern, and that's when you have 3 rows of a given color or a contrasting color. So that creates a box and then a line and then a box. And other than that, I mean, depending on what you mean by patterns. So in anything I've learned or seen of Abenaki basketry, it's an over-under pattern. So your patterns would be through colors, but then you also have cowis. We call it cowis. Other tribes have other words for it, but it's the curls. And so there's 3 different types of cowis that get done. I don't have any images of that, I apologize, but there's the open circle cowis, and then there's, well, actually I do have one picture if I come back to that one basket. Here, wait, nope, here. So, without sharing that screen again, I don't know if I want to do that. You might recall that when I showed the picture of my ancestor and the basket that had come in through the Vermont Historical Society, that was a flat cowis. So it's a curl that's then kind of flattened down to the basket. And then the last one is porcupine cowis. It's very pointed the way you curl it. So it comes out in a strong point. And I don't know that different families have, within the Abenaki, which is all I can speak to, I don't know that different families had different styles.
Okay.
And when I say the Abenaki, I mean the Dyer, Phillips, and Blake families. At Odanak, that could be true, and I'm not an expert on what Odanak families did to differ from one another. I didn't hear anything about that from Jeannie. Oh, Bill was pointing out to me, yes, thank you, Bill. Bill was pointing out that Newt Washburn's, in the Sweetser family, they developed a pattern on the bottom of their basket. It's called the Sweetser Star. Why don't you grab it? I could probably show it. And it's just the way the baskets come together. Bill's getting himself smacked by the ceiling fan. So let's see if, that is the Sweetser Star.
Fantastic. In basket making, from my perspective as a researcher, what I found is basket making is like a fingerprint, and you can look at baskets by different basket makers, and you can almost very frequently, you can tell who the basket maker is if you have other samples to compare it to.
Good point, Vera. Yeah, I didn't think about that. So just the way we finish a rim, Jeannie had a certain way she taught to finish a rim, and she said she can always tell if it's one of her apprentices by the way the rim gets finished. And then Gaby Pelletier is the same thing. She can, you know, it was not customary for basket makers to sign their baskets in days gone by. Today we all do, but back then people didn't. But Gaby can look at a basket and frequently tell you which basket maker made them. But I wouldn't say that comes from, and Vera, you can correct me if you've seen something different. It doesn't come so much from a certain pattern, although I can think of, there's a rainbow cowis technique that a certain basket maker, a Passamaquoddy basket maker, developed. That would be a signature for her baskets, I guess. But yeah, so it could be just a weaving technique that's used.
Yeah, it can be a weaving technique, and sometimes certain designs are passed down within families, like a certain flower, for instance, that might be cut from the ash, or a certain weave, where younger basket makers might learn it, but it's not their time to use it yet until it's passed to them. So here's another question. When making baskets, how often does the design change from the concept to the finish? Some artists say their work takes on a new life or direction of its own during the process. Do you see your work in a similar light?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, I think a lot of us say this, and I certainly feel it, that the basket will tell you what it wants to do. Like, you'll have this idea in mind, and then you start weaving and it doesn't want to do that. And I have an example, a basket I finished recently for an art show in Hopkinton. I was working on it actually over the election. And so one of the baskets I love to make is to take vases and weave over the vase, which is not an uncommon technique, but frequently it was a jar that was woven over, and I do the fancy shaped basket and weave over it. I mean, fancy shaped vase. So at any rate, I was doing a vase for this art show, and I was using that my plan was to have these 3 strips of a color and then go into a different pattern and then do some flat cowis and then reverse the pattern the rest of the way up. And I got up to the flat cowis and got that finished and started to do my reverse and realized I had left off the top strip on that 3 strips. So like I told you before, I call that the friendship pattern. And I was like, oh dear, I left that off. I had repeated it a couple of times. So it was there on the bottom, and then the 3rd strip was missing. So I decided I was going to just reverse the pattern and keep going. And I did that. And then I had a little space left. I did some plain weave and then a colored friendship pattern again. And then it hit me as, of course, I'm weaving all this. The election's happening. There's all this turmoil going on around me, or around all of us, right? And it hit me that it was friendships being tested, being rocked as time went on. And in the end, they survived, they emerged strong. And then I looked at the vase and I saw that right on the curve of it, where I had done the flat cowis, flattening the curve of the pandemic as we were, yeah. So that's that basket. I didn't plan all that. That just, that's what the basket did. And it was a pretty powerful message. The Hopkinton Historical Society bought the basket for their permanent collection to remember the election season through Abenaki basketry. Yeah.
That's a fantastic story. Thank you for sharing that with us. Okay, we have another question that was sent to us prior to this session. Our friend says, I am also a basket weaver and work with twigs and vines primarily. I am curious why these materials do not seem to have been used much by native basket makers in the past. Is it possible that these materials were used but do not last well, so they did not survive? Are the ash and oak baskets stronger?
So I can't speak to oak from personal experience. I've never woven with oak, and it's not part of our, it's not a material we use in weaving. although I've seen the oak baskets, they're beautiful and they are strong. One of the things I forgot to say in the presentation is that initially for our people, we, pre-contact times and even at contact times, especially when there was moving being done. But anyway, we used birch bark containers. And so you can take a piece of birch bark and you can fold it and tack it, and it will do everything a basket does. And it's simple. And so that's what we used. The evidence that we know so far shows that those were the containers that we used. And it was only by observing what the settlers, the colonials, were using and wanted and were willing to purchase that we started to realize that we could plait or weave ash splint and to do the same thing. As far as the other materials go, I don't know. I mean, occasionally Bill and I will, one of my daughter's friends brought a bittersweet wreath to my house. I had no idea that those little berries have seeds in them and what would happen. And so our farm's become overrun with bittersweet. And Bill and I have learned to harvest the bigger ones and split them and use them for rims on baskets. It's really interesting, and we like doing that. And we have this theory that if something becomes valuable to you and you want it, there'll be less of it. So we're hoping we'll cut back on bittersweet that way. But at any rate, I don't know. I think it was a material that was readily available. They knew how to process it. It's what the tourists loved. And certainly, spiritually, sweetgrass is very important to our people, and ash is part of our creation story. I think those were the materials people were familiar with and loved and used. But yeah, baskets can be made out of lots of things. I mean, I know an Abenaki basket maker who likes to weave strips of milk cartons or old film reels, or just have fun making creative baskets out of different things.
Okay, so the next question, thank you for that, Sherry. That was a really good answer. Our next question is, what are your thoughts on folks of settler, colonial, and ancestry practicing ancient skills like basket weaving? Is there something you'd ever be open to teaching to others?
Oh, that's a good question. So when Jeannie learned basket making from Sophie Nolette, Sophie requested that Jeannie promise to never teach Abenaki fancy basket making outside of the Abenaki culture. And Jeannie made that promise to her and has kept it. And in turn, when any of us apprentice with Jeannie, Jeannie asks us to make the same commitment, and we've kept it. So both Jeannie and following her lead as her apprentice, we will do bookmarks, which the bookmark is something that the Abenaki people always started as the first thing that children learned. And so we'll teach that to children or anyone who wants to learn. But for the Odanak style fancy baskets, it must stay within Abenaki people. On the Sweetser side, for the utilitarian basket making, Newt's family was adamant that their basket style should never be taught to anybody outside the family. It was their family signature and style, and it should stay within the family. And Newt learned as a child to make baskets, but then didn't make them his whole life. And I think he was in his 60s when he first picked up the materials and decided to make a basket again, and then became really proficient and worked at it. And there were still family members who were pretty adamant about not teaching it outside the family. And Newt just got to a point where he could see that none of the children or grandchildren were interested in weaving baskets, and that it was something that was going to be lost if it wasn't taught. And so the utilitarian baskets, we were taught by Newt with the understanding that we would pass that on, and that the Sweetser style baskets would always be be there for everyone. So I'm schizophrenic in my basket making. I have fancy and utilitarian roots, and the answer to that question is a bit has a big schism in it.
Certainly, as an artist, I have similar understandings. I do a different type of weaving. You work with ash, that's very rigid, and I work with plant fibers. But within my own family, we have similar understandings that there are certain things that are just passed generation to generation within our family or shared with other Indigenous people, but not commonly within the greater dominant culture. However, there are some things that, some beginner things that we can share. But I definitely understand that and how that feels. So our last question from the audience that was given to us prior to this event was in reference to the materials you work with. They're very curious as to where you source your materials, the harvesting, or however you source your materials.
So then, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, and then after that question, if anyone wants, we can open it up if anybody wants to ask anything else.
Okay. So earlier I mentioned to you that Bill didn't think there was any brown ash locally, and that he came with me to Newt's. And so Newt did show him brown ash, but about the same time I was reading the history of Henniker again. That history of Henniker tells me a lot of things. I never thought about that. But anyway, in reading the history of Henniker, I was reading about it was common when the towns would lay out their boundaries. Again, boxes on maps is the way the colonists lived. So when they were marking out the boundaries of the town, one of the corners of the town was marked by a brown ash tree. And I said, Bill, 4 miles down the road, there was a brown ash tree in 1770. I think they might be around. And then he talked to his forester friend, Brooks McCandlish, who said, "Oh yeah, Bill, they're there. You just thought they were a maple or something. They're not a lumber tree, so they're not anything you would be looking for." So Bill learned about brown ash from Newt, and yeah, we actually had some on our land, and not too long ago we were walking my father's land, the land I grew up on, 40 acres in Hillsborough, and we got down by the brook, and Bill goes, "Look at this." There were several brown ash trees there. So Bill and I, being married to a logger is helpful. We cut our own ash. And right now with the ash borer, we're cutting enough to make sure we have a supply for the rest of our lives. And very sad about what this means for future generations. But we're hopeful. But at any rate, so we cut the logs down, and then Bill uses a draw knife he's sitting here, so I'm going to look at him and make sure I get this right. He uses a draw knife to take the bark off, and then he uses a hammer. I asked Newt, now, which kind of hammer? Blah, blah, blah. I've read this and that. He goes, "That's nice, dear." He goes, "I like this." And he picked up what was it? 2-pound hammer? 3-pound hammer. And then his teaching Bill how to do it was, "Here, take this, go out and pound on the tree. You'll come into it." But at any rate, so once you get the bark peeled off, you pound down the tree, and there's campion layers between the growth rings. And so it loosens the campion layer, and each layer springs up. So Bill scores it so that he gets like an even campion layer. You don't, or an even strip coming up. You don't have to do it. And different people, especially different tribes, do it differently, but that's how we do it. So Bill does all that, and then so he comes in with rolls of rough splint, and then you can imagine when a tree grows, each year it grows a different amount. So some years rings are really, really thick, and you can split those down, and that's how you get the satiny ribbons for fancy baskets that are shiny on both sides. Some years it's so thin that you just scrape it on both sides, and that's really good for utilitarian baskets. I mean, some are so thin and not a good year's growth that they're not even usable, right? And yeah, so and then once they're scraped down or split, Then we have knives that we call them knives, but they're gauges that will cut the splints to the different sizes used. So it's all done by us. And sweetgrass, the same thing. We know a few places we can go to gather sweetgrass, and we've brought some back here and have it growing here on the farm.
So while you were giving that answer, you mentioned the ash borer. I'm assuming you're referring to the Ash Borer Beetle.
Yeah.
And for our audience, maybe some of them have heard about this and some of them haven't. So could you possibly elaborate on that a little bit? What were you referring to, and what are your concerns for the future?
So the green Ash Borer Beetle came from Asia. I'm not sure exactly. I think it came on a shipment. I don't know if anybody knows exactly, but anyway, it's been spreading around the country and killing ash trees. We were really hopeful it wouldn't do as much damage here because the ash are so spread out. It's not like the Midwest where you have huge stands of ash together, but it's doing its number. It's killing them. And I don't know. At one point when it first was discovered in New Hampshire, and they quarantined ash so that it couldn't go out, the way they wrote the regs, they were trying to cover making sure that wood chips didn't leave the county, but the way they wrote it, it would be illegal for a basket to leave the county. So I had to get the USDA forester guy to come out, and we had to get the regs changed. But he was explaining to me, like, when the gypsy moth came, and initially that was a big concern, but something turned out to be a natural predator. So I think there was a lot of hope that a natural predator would emerge, but I haven't seen anything about a natural predator. I know that there's some work being done by, Bill, do you remember, is it the university, is it one of the colleges in New York working with the Penobscots?
I'm not sure, but they're trying to develop a hybrid.
Yes. So anyway, there's work underway between universities and tribal people to try to develop a hybrid that'll be resistant to the ash borer. I just saw on Facebook today that apparently Lowe's in Maine sold ash trees, saplings loaded with the borer. Yeah, that was very disheartening. But at any rate, they're here, they're killing trees. In Vermont, the foresters are starting to work with tribal people and identifying brown ash in the forests that can be taken down and processed into basket splint now before they're killed. And Bill and I intend to work with foresters in New Hampshire to accomplish the same goals. So we're all doing what we can, but it's not hopeful, it's bleak.
Yeah. It's really sad because this is such an important tradition for not just Abenakis, but many other Native American tribes that rely on ash. So hopefully a natural predator will arise at some point in time. I've heard that there is also a possibility that there might be a tree inoculation. But I heard that's also prohibitively expensive.
Expensive, and then what consequences, what side effects will there be from that? I don't know. But yeah, let's be hopeful that we can at least preserve some semblance of it.
Does anybody have any final questions or anything? Burning questions, queries? Yes, unmute yourself.
Hi, I've never heard of brown ash before, but I've heard of black ash. Do you know, are these referring to the same thing?
Yes. Yeah, they are. And there's actually some other ash trees. So the ash trees that Bill and I are using are swamp ash. So they're similar, but a little different. They have less, the heart isn't the small defined heart, and there's more brown wood and less of the white wood, right, Bill? So in a normal brown or black ash, those two words are interchangeable. You get both a darker colored wood that's part of the heartwood and the lighter colored wood. So you can actually make baskets that are kind of two-toned without any dye material. But in the swamp ash that we use, you get more of, it's more consistent. You don't get that big change in color from a heartwood to the tree has less defects, so you get more logs in one tree than you do with the brown ash.
Okay, so are there any other questions? Hi, Marissa. Go ahead and unmute yourself. Marissa's one of my students.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
I was just wondering, thanks, Sherry. I was wondering if there are any like harvesting protocols, like cultural protocols around, like when you harvest the tree.
Well, in anything we harvest, we always give thanks, and it's good to, like when I harvest sweetgrass, I always do a tobacco offering. Honestly, Bill's a logger professionally. That's what he's done to support our family. So I'm not sure he offers tobacco with each tree he cuts, but
I don't have that much.
he said he doesn't have that much tobacco. He's retired now. He doesn't cut trees other than black ash or brown ash for baskets. But at any rate, he's very thankful. I mean, I think thanking the earth for what they get, what we're given, is the most important thing. For sweetgrass, you know, it's really important to not over harvest. Well, and that's true for everything, right? Except right now with brown ash, you want to take what you can get while you can get it. Yeah. But I think those are the things that I primarily know about, is just giving thanks. Offering tobacco is what we do as Native people as a thank you, but it's the concept is to give something back.
Sherry, I want to thank you so much. You've been absolutely amazing tonight. We are so thrilled to have had you join us, and for everyone that came out this evening and signed up to join us with our virtual Abenaki Heritage Weekend in Quebec.